welcome to Talk Advocacy to Me, where we take one question in the light of customer advocacy and marketing, and we just have an informal, impromptu conversation with an expert in the field, which is always a lot of fun. And today is especially fun because I have been able to invite in a long-term colleague and friend, Carrie Wadlington, an absolute rock star marketer in this field. So we are so honored to have her. Carrie, I'm just going to say a little bit about you before we hop into our topic, which is what's top of mind for new CMOs. So why did we bring Carrie in for that topic? So not only is she a brilliant marketer in her own right, she's been in the weeds, in the midst of all of it for, oh man, Carrie, how many years?
Like decades at this point, but keep going, keep going.
Couple decades, okay. So she's had a career all the way from ad agency to serving clients in tech, healthcare, and government. But most recently, she was with a demand generation and marketing operations at Beyond Trust, which was formerly Baumgar, which if you have known me for any amount of time, you know that I started out with 8.5 years at Baumgar. And Carrie sat across from me from most of those years, and I have really fond memories of those times. And now Carrie is a go-to-market advisor, and she is talking to startup CMOs all the time. So we thought it would be really great to have Carrie come in and speak to, hey, what's top of mind for new CMOs? But, Carrie, thank you so much for coming on. We're delighted to have you.
Oh, I'm so excited. Like I've always enjoyed listening, so it's great to be on this side of it.
Yeah. So it's really nice when life comes 360 as well. I mean, seriously, I think Carrie and I were just babies when we started working next to each other. Pretty sure I was 22,
I know.
23.
I mean, it's crazy. And then too, Liz, like when you think about what we experienced in that role, like, and we were able to go from, a startup to a scale up all the way to, well over $100 million in ARR. So definitely saw a lot along the way, right?
Yeah, we sure did. And I just want everyone on the call to understand that Carrie was actually my first introduction to customer advocacy. So I'll just tell this story real quick. Carrie, one day, she was a early adopter of Eloqua. Some of you may remember Eloqua, that was acquired by Adobe, but Carrie turned around to me one day. I was complaining that it was so hard to get customers to do this and that. I just, like, it was hard spending time roping in all the references that we needed. And Carrie said, oh, I'm in this really interesting program at Eloqua where I don't know, I just kind of tell them what I'm interested in and they send me opportunities. And that was my first introduction to an advocacy program. I followed it from there, and that's where my path led me. So, Carrie, I guess I owe my I don't
Well,
know.
that and to Heather Faye and the other like smart folks at Eloqua who built that out. Like, I don't know if you all remember, but they had what I still think is like one of the best communities that ever been a part of. And so much of it was not only was it like really helpful, like there was a lot of like technical support and great ideas, but it was like incredibly like authentic, if that makes sense. And but yeah, Heather and T, they did a phenomenal job there.
Well, I think that must have been the cusp of when the word authentic became very, very popular in this. And then I will not move forward until we introduce my partner in crime over here, Dina Zedek, who's always on Talk Advocacy as well. So Dina, say hi.
Hola. Hi.
Oh,
Minor correction. Minor correction. I believe Eloqua was acquired by Oracle.
oh my gosh,
Just
you
wanted.
guys.
It's
It
hard to
is
keep
hard to
up.
keep up.
It is. It's
It
hard to
is.
keep up.
So sorry. I was like thinking in my head as I said that, I was like, man, I hope I got
No,
that
that was
right.
the
But
big
okay.
M. So just wanted, just wanted to kind of, but
The big M. I love that.
Oh, maybe we can edit that out. Alicia's like, nope, gonna leave that. Gonna leave that. Stay
keeping
humble,
it
guys.
real,
Stay
keeping it real.
humble.
Hey, Carrie,
Uh,
I'm so happy to have you here. I've heard stories about you over the years from Liz, and as Liz said, these kind of full circle moments as you get into this, I would say like midpoint of a career, they're just so fun because they force you to kind of look back. And then in Talk Advocacy, to me, of course, we're also about kind of looking forward. So this is great. Wonderful to be here. I'm just going to kind of be the third wheel. I'm here. I'm here to hang out.
Nice.
Awesome. All right. Well, so like I said, Carrie advises CMOs, startup CMOs most specifically. And I was thinking, okay, what's the relationship there? And as I was talking to Carrie, we were talking about like when does advocacy and customer marketing even come up now? So, um, it's still a sort of new space, but much more heavily adopted than it was 10 years ago. So, where does that conversation, if at all, Carrie, come in when you have someone who's either new to their business, like they're launching their business for the first time, or maybe they're new to the CMO role because they're part of a startup and they've been given a big hefty role that maybe they haven't had in the past. Does customer advocacy and marketing come up?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there is a lot of awareness, I would say, in heads of marketing, really all stages of companies around customer marketing, customer advocacy, and the value it brings to the larger organization. So I'm doing in my conversations, it's less about, what is this and what does this sort of look like, and more about like the dial, like sort of what you were saying, Liz, is like, when do we introduce this? And so I don't consider myself like an expert. I don't really like that title. It feels a little cold and like muscular. So what I really help go to market leaders figure out is really like the framework for thinking about this and the questions to ask to really look at the market, look at where the company is, look at the different functions within the organization, and then make that decision, because it's always a trade-off, right? We have to have some level of customer marketing and advocacy, but it's like the dial of how much. Like, do we need a dedicated headcount or a dedicated team, or are these functions, these pieces that are you have to have them, are they then like sprinkled across a lot of other roles? So it's really that consideration. And I think about it as when you think of a company and how they're growing, some of those questions that we typically focus on are like, well, how many customers do you have? Like, what is the white space within that customer base? How willing are your customers, to participate in advocacy programs? Because if they're super eager, you may want to like fuel those flames, right? Maybe even invest ahead of what you might consider like a traditional advocacy maturity curve, right? So I mean, those are some of the things that we think about. But the good news is, I think, thanks to folks like you two, as well as so many of the other thought leaders in the space, like I think customer advocacy, customer marketing is top of mind. And I think like the other thing I would add is you definitely saw it as folks were like going into the pandemic. Now with all the like economic uncertainty, I think every executive, not just CMOs, like your first instinct is like, we have to protect the base. So protecting those renewals, and then also figuring out like, how can we drive more value out of for our customers, and then also to the business from our customers. I think we're seeing that again, is like, and that again just plays right back into the importance of customer marketing and advocacy.
That's an interesting point and a segue into a thought that's been kind of rolling around in my head for a bit here. That as we came into the pandemic, and yes, the focus was on the customer, and there's this big upswing with customer advocacy. And for Liz and I, it was like, yes, like we have arrived. Customer advocacy has finally hit the C-suite. People get it. And then now we have this downturn, and some of the first people to go are those customer advocacy folks. So it feels to me like maybe we didn't do the right type of convincing or value proving in that moment in time. Otherwise, these people might be more secure in their job. So what is the value of customer advocacy to CMOs that professionals need to get across? And Liz, welcome
Yeah,
your
I mean,
ideas.
Dina, I love that. Like, that's such a good question. And I think that sometimes marketers struggle, and even CMOs, they struggle to communicate to others within the business in the language of the business. And at the end of the day, like customer advocacy, in my opinion, it's 100% about business, right? Like, I think it sometimes has this reputation about being really feel good. And I feel all the feelings. Like, I love those things. I love delighting customers. I love making people happy. But at the end of the day, right, like we have growth targets, we have efficiency targets that need to be hit. And so I think it's not just awareness around the space, but also individuals in those roles, as well as like the marketing leaders. Like, how do we then articulate the value that we're driving, and also ensure that our strategy is aligning with the goals of the business? So, for example, in some companies I've worked with, what that looks like, there is a relatively small TAM, a small customer base, low upsell opportunity because of the products that we have. Renewals are fairly strong, right? So in that scenario, as someone who is tasked with customer advocacy, I would be really focused on how can I leverage my advocate to drive new business. Like, there's one company that I've met with in the past where 80% of their new business is like directly driven from customers. That's phenomenal. And is especially with all of private equity, with executive teams, you're hearing efficient growth, demand driven from your customer base through not, it doesn't have to be official referrals, but through word of mouth is always going to be your most efficient channel. And I think that it becomes so I think that there's like a data piece of it, but then there's also like understanding the overall like landscape. Google just released about 7 days ago some additional changes to search advertising, which for not all, but for most companies is a key revenue source when you're looking at direct attribution. I've heard through a number of different channels, companies are already seeing decreases or declines in search that we believe are linked to generative AI. So people are starting to go to ChatGPT and say, who's the best in XYZ? So the market is shifting. And I think when I come back to how are these organizations going to kind of weather this, is like, things are changing with those traditional sources. I think it's through like capturing that word of mouth. Like, that's how you're going to cut through the noise. That's how you're going to stand out. And so I think there's an opportunity for customer advocacy leaders and CMOs to like better paint that picture.
Carrie,
A
that's so
lot of rambling.
no, I'm totally with you, because like you're saying that, and I've thought about ChatGPT. We've spent a good bit of time, of course. Who hasn't? If you're in this space, so the question is always like, when are you going to, or how do you believe what you believe? Like, where are the sources? I know things will change, but where is the data coming from? If everyone has access to the data, what's going to be different about my content from your content? If we're all just scraping content from the internet, and then how will we start to have a trust crisis, which we've had in the past as well, which is, I don't know, like, you could have written anything. This blog post could have been written by AI. This chatbot is probably AI,
Yes.
etc. So there, I feel like there might be a hunger coming of yes, we're going to put more and more stake in something we know is coming directly from an actual person. I mean, we are going to be like a little bit in competition with machines here. That is going to be an interesting movement, I think, for advocacy or word of mouth marketing. But I think the way we leverage advocates might have to change. I don't know what that 100% looks like right now, but I think that it's really, really interesting. I think you're onto something there. Um, and then I wanted to go back to something that you said earlier too, which, it's levers. I think that's a really good way to put it. There's dials. And let's say even during this economic time, there's been a lot of dial choosing. What do we turn up? What do we turn down? And when it comes to marketing, you use the word, so we're going to pull it out here and sit here for a minute, but attribution, it's tough, right? And like you said, with word of mouth marketing, with advocacy marketing, this might be something that our practice struggles with, which is direct attribution. So if I'm getting into the mindset of a CMO and I'm comparing search, which I can look at number of clicks, I can look at number of conversions, and it's just a very simple story. But then I'm looking at advocacy where someone maybe put a testimonial out there on social media. They maybe talked to, did a direct reference. Maybe they did a little upsell in their organization. There is a story, but it's a much more intricate story. Do you find that CMOs are inclined to the simpler stories?
So I have what in some circles are very unpopular opinions about marketing attribution. And it's funny to me, Liz, like, and Dean, I don't know if you all feel this way. It's like, started working, like I said, decades ago. And it's just mind boggling to me that we're still having a lot of the same conversations. Because even in those channels where we feel like we can directly attach, revenue to the ad, even that's severely limited. I mean, we're entering this like cookieless future. I could go on, but I won't. But circling back to, I've seen a couple of different approaches to, sort of like nailing down that value. I think in some cases, and a lot of this is like market driven. I've seen one company where they were able to get customers, or I'm sorry, like future customers, prospects, to say in the form fill, even like, hey, I heard about you through XYZ. I think that was in some ways that was unique to this organization and may not apply to everyone, right? But that's one approach, is like a simple form fill that's like, how did you hear about us? And it's going to be imperfect, and it's not going to show the absolute value of any of these things, but you'll start seeing like little bleeps of little peaks of information, right, that show you like, okay, well, there's probably a lot more value that's underreported across these channels. The other thing that I find is that, CMOs need to be held accountable to business results. And I think the way in which that happens isn't always in the best interest of the business. So I definitely view a CMO as responsible for revenue, but also pipeline creation, regardless of source. Now, this can definitely vary based on the business model. So a company that's product-led growth, e-com, is going to have a very different mix or way of tracking than someone that's an enterprise, sell offline, seven-figure deals, right? But so I think at the highest level, the CMO needs to be tracking to those goals. And in programs where you can show that direct attribution, micromanaging that as much as possible. So you brought up search, right? So you should be able to show a positive return on search. But when you're looking at, things like your advocacy activities, tying that to pipeline is probably not really the right goal. So then it becomes the question of, well, what are the goals? And then how do we draw that path of those goals to pipeline generation or renewals, right? And I find that sometimes if you're showing that like, hey, like we've been able to engage key customers with heavy renewals, like this much of renewal booking, right? That are in our ICP that we know are influencers, like it can be really hard to like argue that that's a bad idea. And of course, there's always like give and take, but it is just as much like art as it is science.
I know Dina had something she wanted to
Well,
add here.
it might be a little out of context now, but two things. One, you said it is mind-boggling to you that we're kind of still talking about this, and it really is. It is mind-boggling to me that we are still talking about internal buy-in when it comes to customer advocacy. Like the practice has been around for a while. We're doing our best to connect the dots to real business impact, but yet we're still focused on these kind of recurring themes of internal buy-in. I don't see other value drivers inside the business as fixated on internal buy-in as customer advocacy. I think it kind of sets us on a little bit of a back foot. I haven't unpacked that fully for myself, why, 15 years later, we're still talking about internal buy-in. That was my one thought. My other thought, just kind of taking us back a little bit here, something that has just occurred to me as these things do when we're on Talk Advocacy to me. In the introduction, you talked about your experience with the Eloqua program. We talk about the best practitioners in customer advocacy are those who can kind of walk a mile in their clients' or customers' shoes, like that you can experience customer advocacy on the receiving end, and that informs your mindset as you move forward. But yet we know executives are a really hard advocate audience to engage. So we default to things like cabs, which aren't, you know, really, um, uh, set up as customer advocacy programs, right? They're executive engagement programs. So I'm wondering if to really, really close the gap with executives, we need to figure out how to crack that executive advocacy nut.
Mm, mm,
That's right. I think it's both like, you're so right, Dina. Like, how do you get executives to experience what it's like to be in like a positive advocacy
mhm,
program, but then also like, how do you improve like the internal comms of like folks, like for example, like I can remember at Beyond Trust, like I stood up in front of our go to market team and shared with them like my experience with MailChimp. Like I loved MailChimp. And so it's like by sort of like espousing like, hey, like this is the customer experience that they gave me, and this is how it made me into an advocate, and here's what I brought to the table. Like that can go a long way too. Just because executives have it's a tough nut to crack, like to your point.
It is, and I think that's really interesting. And maybe it's because at this point, so we have a peer, Kevin Miller, who does marketing strategy, and he had a really interesting point, which is most CMOs, especially when you're new, you're gonna lean toward whatever you were as where did you start? Where is your area of focus and expertise? So if I'm Carrie and I came from demand gen and I step into a CMO role, I'm probably going to lean pretty heavily into my CMO expertise. And it's probably just common sense that because this is a newer practice and we haven't seen it as elevated as quickly, so you don't have as many CMOs coming from a background where it was like, oh, community and advocacy was my space and I've made it up to the CMO role. So that isn't their first formula. They have a formula that they keep referring back to that has worked for them in the past. And then for the other parts of their formula, they're obviously having to rely on experts who sit on their team. So I thought that was really insightful when Kevin said that, because I was like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. That's maybe why when a CMO steps in, that's not like their first. And we're waiting for some rock stars in this field to kind of grow up through the ranks until they're the CMO at a startup, and they're bringing that as part of their formula. And that I think that's probably maybe a bit of what's happening there.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I mean, I think the other thing you're seeing like a big shift in, and I was having a conversation not too long ago with a B2B marketing leader who had an extensive background in B2C, which is, I mean, those folks are, it's just fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like B2B, in a lot of the ways in which we market, we think that we're marketing to rational decision makers who like occasionally feel. Whereas like B2C knows that we are actually feeling creatures who like occasionally think. And I think as more and more marketing leaders start understanding that, especially in times of uncertainty, that people are leading just as much with their emotions as they are with their with their brains, if you will. I think that building that trust that comes with a really strong customer advocacy program will be a little bit more front and center. But I mean, you're right. Like you start, it's where you grew up, right?
I love that you brought it back to B2C. That makes me really excited because I think the tie is huge with advocacy and B2C, because B2C is and always has relied on this idea of advocacy. The sales cycle is so different. Maybe people think because in B2B you're making a big one-time purchase, you're using a lot more of your head. And hopefully we are using our head. But a lot of people don't start their B2B brand and marketing strategy with like, what are we going to make people feel? And so that is something that Dean and I always try to sit down on. Even with advocacy programs, a lot of people don't start there. And that's where we like to start is, what do you want people to feel when they are attached to this program? Results will come, but we have to build an experience, a sense of engagement. And I think B2B is getting there. So maybe we're behind in two areas, right? We don't have the executives who've experienced that at this time. And as B2B, we are a little behind in the ways we market to, as you say, individuals. We're still marketing in a large sense to organizations. And so we haven't tapped into the psychology as hard as B2C has in order
Yeah.
to motivate people to an action.
Yeah. But I'm certainly seeing bright spots, right? Like there's definitely folks who are coming around, and like I give these examples, not saying it's like this is how to do it, right? Like, but this is right for these individual companies. Like I'm seeing situations where one head of marketing, she pulled all third party events and is only focusing on first party, which are going to be this blend of like both customers and prospects. And their real focus is on sort of the ecosystem. So not just partners, although that's certainly inclusive, but also other like influencers in the space. And it's really phenomenal, right? It's really cool stuff. So there's definitely bright spots. Like I'm seeing like a transition, but I think you're right, is whenever there's uncertainty, whenever there's this tendency to pull back, it's that reptilian brain kind of kicks in, and you have to sort of pause and be like, wait a minute, I have to balance that short term and the long term. Like, how do I sort of do both?
Um, this is such a fascinating talk, Carrie. I feel like I could talk to you forever because I think I've always been like that with you, which is like, oh my next? What's coming? Where are we going? And that is definitely how Carrie's mind thinks. So she's a big, big thinker. You're one of the smartest marketers I know, Carrie. Um, so I'm just going to leave us with this question for Carrie, which is, so Carrie, if I'm in customer marketing, which can mean a lot of different things, that can be everything from engaging long term to build that loyalty. It can mean I am doing upsell campaigns, and I might be running advocacy programs. So if I'm in customer marketing, but I am trying to think of how to just increase the perceived value of customer marketing and advocacy directly to the CMO level. What is your main piece of advice? I'm really putting you on the spot here.
I would apply the same principles that you apply to your customers internally. You cannot sell customer advocacy. You need everyone in the business to be selling customer advocacy. So what I'd really love to see, or what I love to see in customer marketing, customer advocacy professionals, is when they are the best at working cross-functionally and then also working with their customers. And some of the programs I can think back on, some that you ran, Liz, and that others I've worked with have run, we felt like they were success not because the dashboard was lit up green, but because we had actual feedback from customers and our frontline teams of like, they said this made the world to us. Like this made a big difference. So I don't know if that's helpful, but
I don't know. Is CMO going to listen to that, Carrie?
internal advocacy program.
Yes, there are definitely two advocacy programs going on at any one given time, and we
Yep.
will always say that you as an advocacy professional, you have two sets of advocates. You have customer advocates, and you have your internal advocates. Dina, would you add anything to what Carrie said here?
No, just that it's been really fun to be on this panel with you both. You have such a fun energy and such a natural connection and a great history. So this has been a really great chat. A little kind of like outside of the practitioner
Yeah,
box, but really
nice.
great. Thank you so much, Carrie.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Thank
Carrie.
you both.
Loved having you. All right, bye-bye, everyone.